Hi, Cecilia.
Hi, Nick. Great to
Oh,
see you.
hello. How are you? Yes, I'm very well. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to log in and connect to audio.
No problem at all. And we're having a little break to do the clap at 8 o'clock. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll address that all in the intro in a minute. Logistics, etc. Have you been able to enjoy the beautiful weather?
Well, it's been a pretty intense day today, as you can imagine. We finally got a good result out of the government in the end, but it's been an intense day today. Yeah. How are you? Are you presumably that's where you've been working for the duration, or?
Yeah, pretty much. I was really pleased to hear the news, actually. It was something I was going to highlight tonight. Yeah, that was really, really brilliant. And I think just such a win for not just Labour, but the whole of society in terms of that U-turn and people not being subjected to that. But yeah, it's really, really good news. So you must be pleased.
Yes, I mean, I thought it was one of those areas that strategically, if we chose, we could pressurize them on, but they did U-turn more quickly than I expected. And I thought that the Prime Minister was doubling down on it yesterday, but it seems that we've managed to shift him, which is, as you, and ultimately it's about this deep, deep manifest unfairness that people shouldn't be subject to. And that's the major thing, really, to actually produce that. That's why we all do it, isn't it? Because we want to make
exactly
people.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I think we're just about ready to kick off if you are.
Yes.
I'll give just a quick intro. So hello and welcome everyone to the Young Fabians and International Policy Group's joint event on the COVID-19 crisis. Tonight we have joining us Nick Thomas-Symonds MP for Torfan and Shadow Home Secretary. Quickly on logistics, we'll be taking a break at 8 p.m. to clap for key workers, and also please put your questions in the chat box. You can also upvote each other. So Nick, firstly, congratulations on your appointment. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight. And secondly, I'd like to highlight some really positive news, which is the government U-turn on the abominable surcharge for migrant workers. So tonight we'll be focusing on three key areas, which are: one, scrutinising the government's COVID strategy or lack thereof; two, looking at the way other countries around the globe have handled the pandemic; and three, looking at how the UK measures up. To highlight a few of the issues which have arguably culminated in a damning indictment of the government, we've had the Cheltenham Racing Festival, attended by 250,000 people straight after the WHO declared a global pandemic. Contact testing and tracing initially abandoned, now being planned for June, and no quarantine for approximately 100,000 arrivals to the UK since lockdown. Boris Johnson's lockdown easing announcement, as I'm sure we've all seen, created more questions than answers, and as Keir rightly pointed out, up until the point where we reached the highest death toll in Europe, the government was comparing us to other countries, but has now dropped the international comparison. So we'll get more into that later, but for now I'd like to hand over to Nick for his opening remarks on the topic as a whole, and then we'll get into more specific questions. So to you, Nick.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Cecilia, and thank you to everybody who's joining us this evening. It's a real pleasure to join you. I was very pleased to have the invitation, and it's very nice to have the chance to discuss these issues with you this evening. I think firstly, I just wanted to say that we've adopted a very particular type of opposition over recent weeks, and we have this discussion against a background of thousands of people having died. The official government figure is crept up to over 36,000, according to today's press conference. And I think we look at graphs, we look at statistics, but we all know that every single one of those deaths is a huge tragedy for the family and the friends of that person. I think that's something we always have to bear in mind. I think I've had that very much in my mind as a politician throughout this crisis. So what I've been seeking to do, as of all the front bench, is to be responsible, but also not to be afraid to point out when things go wrong and to try and push the government to change strategy when it's going in the wrong direction. And I am pleased today. There is so much more for us to do, absolutely, and in terms of the injustices in our society, not least with regard to migrants' rights. Of course there is, but we picked very carefully the issue of the immigration health surcharge and its impact on care workers and health workers. It has a wider impact, of course, but we're in a position where we have just over 200 MPs in Parliament. So it isn't like the last Parliament where we could win big parliamentary votes, but we have to find ways pragmatically of exerting pressure on the government. And I think this week's been a good example of that. And it is good to say today that people who would have been subject to that very unfair charge are not now going to be subject because of the pressure that's been brought to bear on the government this week. So I think that's something we can all take some credit from, because it's been a real team effort. People signing the party petition, raising things across social media. It really has been a big team effort. So I am pleased to see that today, and it does illustrate what we can achieve together as a movement, even in these most difficult of times. To move, though, to the issue of the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis and comparisons, I'll make a few general remarks for now, but obviously certainly get into more detail when we come to the questions and answers. Sadly, I don't think it's any wonder that the government has dropped the international comparisons. And Keir Starmer raised that on the 13th of May at Prime Minister's questions. The government and Boris Johnson had no convincing answer. And I think the sad, brutal reality of it is that we are, frankly, in a dreadful position as compared to other countries. And, in preparation for this evening, I've been looking at the very latest statistics, and they make, I'm afraid, for grim reading. And the government has previously argued there are different ways of measuring the statistics, and that is true, but whichever measure you choose to take, it just looks awful, I'm sad to say. We are, significantly ahead of Italy now in terms of the numbers of people who've died, ahead of Spain. And I'm sure we'll all remember, particularly back in March, when there was a period where more could have been done, when those awful images from Lombardy, in particular in northern Italy, were on our screens and we saw all those terrible problems. Yet, that said, there are other countries in the world that clearly have done significantly better. New Zealand, for example, has had a tiny number of deaths compared to the rest of the country. I'm not minimizing that for a moment. Every single one of those deaths is a tragedy. But if you look at what has happened in New Zealand, for example, compared to so many other places, and that combination of firm strategy to eliminate the disease and excellent leadership, communicating messaging to the public that we've seen from Jacinda Ardern throughout the last few weeks and months, clearly has made a huge difference. And even to the answer that, well, okay, New Zealand is very different from a European country. Well, maybe, but have a look at Germany as well, which has managed to keep its death toll way below ours, ramping up testing in the way that Germany has been able to do. And even within the United Kingdom, if you moved away to another measure from just numbers and looked at what they call the excess deaths, the number of deaths that have occurred over and above what would usually be expected at this time of year, and within the United Kingdom, Wales is 43% worse, Northern Ireland 44% worse, Scotland 62%, and England 73% worse. I think these are shocking and damning statistics. Now, I firmly believe that there will be an inquiry. What precise form it will take, we will obviously have to see, but to look precisely at what the UK government has done in this period, but it seems to me that there are two huge questions. The first is, our preparedness, how well prepared was the UK government, and secondly, the decisions that they've taken throughout the period of the coronavirus crisis. And on the preparation, I think it's pretty clear that having had a decade of austerity, that our public services didn't have the resilience that they otherwise would have done going into the crisis. You think of the vacancies in social care, for example, in England, and the whole awful picture of social care, by the way, is a serious concern as to how the government's handled the crisis. But there's also wider questions around specific preparations for an outbreak. There's been a lack of disclosure on exercise Cygnus back in 2016, that government exercise that was carried out as to how resilient the UK was to deal with the pandemic. Did they prepare for the right one? Huge questions around that. Then in terms of the handling of the crisis itself, there's always been a sense that the government was behind the curve, whether it was slow on PPE, slow on testing, slow on lockdown. And there are some very specific things that I think will have to be looked at. The World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, as Cecilia said, on the 11th of March. That same day, thousands of Atletico Madrid fans were allowed to fly into Liverpool for a Champions League game, even though Spain was a hotspot of the outbreak. The Cheltenham Festival, as has been mentioned, also took place with, 250,000 people coming into close contact with each other. And the lockdown didn't actually happen until the 23rd of May. And I've been pressing Priti Patel for weeks, as have others, the Home Affairs Select Committee, other MPs, as to precisely what the strategy was prior to the 23rd of March, with flights that were arriving in the United Kingdom. And insofar as we've been able to work out, it seems that 3 flights from Wuhan and 1 from Tokyo. And the Tokyo flight was the one that had the passengers from the Diamond Princess on it. The Diamond Princess, the cruise ship, has the sad, if you like, mark that the first British death occurred on there on the 28th of February. But, in that period up to the 23rd of March, yes, of course, the original outbreak had been in Wuhan, but we had already seen what was happening in northern Italy and what was in Spain. And I have had no answer of any description from the Home Secretary as to why it was that there was no further quarantining going on in that period. And that's clearly something that the government, as a bare minimum, needs to publish the scientific advice on, so that we can see what the strategy was. I also think that as the lockdown has gone on, I do worry about lost time on the issue of test, track and trace. When we talk about international comparisons, Germany has significant lab capacity and has been able to ramp up testing extremely quickly. I can remember being on the media a couple of months ago, and the British strategy had stopped on the 12th of March. There was community testing, there was test, track and trace. That was stopped, and there's still not been a convincing explanation as to why. Whilst Germany was ramping up its testing to 500,000 a week, even at that stage of the outbreak, and is way beyond that now. And even when we've had the lockdown, we've had weeks and weeks to work on this. I was listening to Matt Hancock carefully at the press conference today. He's talking about test, track and trace being, quote, on track for the 1st of June. But this is absolutely vital. Other countries have ramped up their testing capacity far, far more quickly. And I think we need to look at why that is. Particularly, and I say this for 2 reasons, the countries that seem to have kept the infection rates down. I think of South Korea as another very good example of this, where they've used a very comprehensive test, track and trace strategy. That has to be the route out of the lockdown. It is so important. And I think there are serious questions as to why the government hasn't ramped that up. Now, there's a lot of different aspects I am keen to cover in the Q&A as well. I think that we've obviously set out our particular views on the easing of the lockdown, not least in terms of safety for people going back to their workplaces, and the whole issue of personal protective equipment is another huge failure from the government. The constant statistics about how much PPE was available, and then the tragic stories from the front line of people having to fashion their own PPE or not having PPE available, is not just a huge aspect of what's already happened. As people increasingly go back to work, that's going to become absolutely vital as well, that people are able to work in safety. So I think there are serious questions to answer. There are serious issues for us to keep up the pressure on as an opposition going forward as well. But thank you once again for allowing me to join you, and I'm very much looking forward to a Q&A and a discussion on this evening. So thank you very much, Cecilia.
Of course. Yeah, so sort of picking up on that accountability question, I was wondering about the implication of corruption in scrutiny itself. So we know that more than a dozen MPs actually rebelled against Boris Johnson's government recently, backing Harriet Harman's amendment, and had a row about how the Commons was going to hold the government to account.
Yeah.
So they failed in their attempt, and a Tory MP handpicked by Downing Street has been elected chairman of a powerful select committee whose sole task is to interrogate the Prime Minister. Do you think this is an attempt to mute criticism by procedural means? And if so, what can Labour do to mitigate this kind of escape from accountability?
Well, yes, I mean, the government clearly wanted to impose someone who was their own choice as chair of the liaison committee, and that's precisely what they did. It was a free vote technically in the Commons. I mean, I was very proud to support Harriet Harman's amendment because I thought that the scrutiny required of the Prime Minister is so important, and the liaison committee, all the select committee chairs together interrogating the Prime Minister, I think is a very important part of Parliament. And I think it's important because Prime Minister's questions is important, of course it is, and asking the Prime Minister questions every week. Within our select committee system, you get the chance to ask questions in more detail and in more depth. And clearly the select committee chairs are all very practiced interrogators who are able to carry out this task. And I thought it was important as a principle that they chose their own chair rather than it being imposed by the government. I thought that was the wrong thing to do. And I do think, yes, absolutely, I think it's to protect the Prime Minister, and I don't think that it should have happened. I would have much preferred it to have remained as it was. Now, in terms of the wider question, what do we do about it? Well, we've made an attempt to stop it through Harriet Harman's amendment. But we have to be, I think, smart and creative in our opposition. It's, I lived through the last Parliament when, because it was a hung Parliament, it meant you had a chance of winning major parliamentary votes. And there were some parliamentary votes in that period when you didn't actually quite know what the result of them was going to be, because you never quite knew how the numbers would work. Some of them were extremely close. Those days sadly have gone because the government now has a majority of 80. So as with our pressing the government on the health and social care workers in respect of the immigration health surcharge, we've got to be targeted. We often are not going to end up with everything that we want because of the numbers we've got in Parliament. I think we've got to be smart, targeted, and able as well to make sure we get excellent public support for what we're doing, because we are up against the parliamentary numbers. And I think that's the same in terms of holding the Prime Minister to account, which we've shown on an issue this week we certainly can do, and I think that's what we need to do going forward.
Absolutely, can't agree with you more there. So slightly different angle, I noticed that you and Jess Phillips requested to attend the Hidden Harms Domestic Abuse Conference, and that request was denied. So I did an event recently with Jill Furness MP actually on the disproportionate pandemic impact on women, in fact. And, we've got such an awful rise in domestic abuse. We've got women in lower paid sectors, the precariat essentially, and women, academic paper submissions are decreasing. You've got all of these problems, and then you've kind of got the government still being partisan about this. So I wondered what your thoughts on that were in general, and what can Labour do to help mitigate those impacts, especially around domestic violence and abuse?
Yes, and when I first had the job of Shadow Home Secretary and I was appointed, the first major intervention I made was on this issue of domestic abuse, which is a huge issue for me personally, but particularly an issue in terms of the situation we find ourselves in. We told people to stay at home. I appreciate that we might come on in a moment to how that message has changed in due course, but on a stay-at-home message, that is clear enough. But if home is not a haven, it's not a safe place for you, then that's an extraordinarily difficult message. And often with controlling behavior, an abuser having someone who is unable to leave the environment they're in is, I'm sad to say, ideal conditions for awful, terrible abuse and continued abuse. And that's what that was the other reason I came in so strongly on that at the start. And along with Jess Phillips, I've made positive suggestions to the government. It's not like I've just been criticising. I've actually come up with ideas for them. I actually came up with a package that I went out on the media and pushed in terms of an amount of money from the pot that the Chancellor had announced for charities. I came up and asked for 10% of it to be ring-fenced for the domestic abuse charities. And by the way, the domestic abuse charities and the wider violence against women and girls sector, I've been meeting regularly over my weeks in the job. I speak to them about what the issues are, and I try to put constructive proposals forward to the government. And I still believe that's the right approach, you know. And the government did make an announcement of a ring fence £76 million. They also made an announcement prior to that of £2 million to assist with the national helpline. Now, there is a huge job beyond that, because once you've pressed for the funding's got to get to the front line. And that has been an issue, frankly, and it's something that Jess Phillips and I will continue to press on, because the money has to get to where it needs to be, and frankly needs to get there fast, because there are serious issues day by day by day. You can't be losing time. So that's going to be my strategy going forward. But I can't say anything other than I was deeply disappointed with the Home Secretary's response to the perfectly reasonable request for us to attend the Hidden Harm Summit. We've been constructive, and I just don't think this is the time for partisan politics. I think the issue is far too important for that.
Definitely. Yeah, and I just think in general, it's something that in a time of crisis should transcend politics and should have cross-party support. And especially with you having such a constructive proposal and package, it's, you know, to refuse help is just disappointing. But anyway, so on the government's messaging, as you mentioned, what do you think of Boris Johnson's recent announcement? And do you think these new colours, a lot of people have picked up on social media that it's kind of a subliminal nudge towards a go symbol and a go kind of message? And stay alert is obviously not really helpful to anyone, and not something that an epidemiologist or microbiologist is exactly going to advise anyone to do. So, and then also there's the question of, if you've got the devolved administrations quite divided on this, you know, you've got Northern Ireland and Scotland still staying with the stay at home message. Do you feel that that confuses people, and what do you actually think the message should be?
Well, I'm speaking to you from Wales, Cecilia, where obviously the government here in Wales, the Labour government in Wales, took some steps to start to ease the lockdown. Like, for example, on exercise, you can now go out to exercise as much as you want to, but in Wales, you have to start at home and finish at home. And, you know, the reason that was introduced is because when the lockdown was first mooted in March, we had people turning up en masse at beauty spots, for example, in Snowdonia and in West Wales. So the Welsh government was very clear that we can't have people congregating in that way. So they changed the exercise to be that you had to start and finish at home. And there's been some other easing measures on garden centres, on opening of recycling centres in local authorities. But that's been done alongside keeping the stay-at-home message. you know, the easing has been done without that lack of clarity on the message. And I have to say, I thought the whole episode of Boris Johnson's announcement on the Sunday night, with some measures it appeared didn't come into effect until the Wednesday, though that wasn't clear on the Sunday night. It seemed to be that people were expected to go back to work on the Monday. The change, as you say, Cecilia, not just in the message, but the colour, the red colour changing to the green colour, which is that's clearly from stop to go. That's what the two colours mean. I thought was extremely concerning, and I was out on the media, I think it was Monday actually, the Monday morning, and I was extremely concerned because I don't see why you couldn't do what the Welsh government has done, which is, yes, you can in a structured way start to ease the lockdown and support doing that, but you've got to keep that clarity of message. And I've watched government ministers this week at press conferences. If you ask the straight question, should you go stay at home or should you go to work, and there's been various versions of that going on this week. And I think if we've learned, we knew it anyway, but if we learn one thing from the crisis about communication and clarity of communication, it's so, so important. And I wish the UK government had done what the devolved administrations have done, and like here in Wales, and stayed with that clear message.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, and clarity is definitely fundamental. I know a lot of people are still really confused and are kind of just interpreting it by themselves now, and feeling guilty if they do things even within government guidelines. So sort of turning to a slightly different point, so looking at the kind of countermeasures implemented in different countries, you've got a police-enforced curfew in Serbia. As you mentioned, Germany's rapid increase in testing capacity, and there are some which aren't so great. So Orban, for example, in Hungary, has arguably exploited the crisis to consolidate power. So there's a wide spectrum of different countermeasures, and we've had New Zealand, Greece, Finland, Norway, Germany, and Iceland particularly praised, and also South Korea. But our efficacy has obviously been called into question. So going off the kind of point about Orban, do you think that there's a kind of danger to the democracy in the UK? Are there ways you think that the government is exploiting the crisis? For example, I remember reading articles about the selling off of data, private NHS patient data, to the US in an information exchange. Do you think there are ways that this crisis is going to be exploited and will ultimately become injurious to democracy?
Well, two points really, and I think you're absolutely right to highlight all these different things that have happened around the world and the different actions of government. I sincerely hope that there isn't the exploitation that you talk about. We may come on to talk about the tracing app in a bit, but clearly appropriate safeguards to prevent any of that sort of exploitation, whether it's for data for surveillance purposes, for commercial purposes, investigatory purposes, that it purely has to be for the purpose that it's intended, which is clearly to track, trace, and isolate people who've firstly been confirmed as having coronavirus and those they come into contact with. But what's worried me really is not so much exploitation as ineptitude really from the UK government. And I mentioned a little bit in my introductory remarks, Cecilia, around issues where I felt there'd been a real slowness, and whether it's personal protective equipment, where sourcing it and distributing it seems to have been a huge problem, whether it's in terms of the lockdown, but particularly, and I do want to emphasize, this issue of testing, because we've been talking, both the front bench I'm a part of now and indeed the previous front bench, we're talking about testing for months and months and months. And the government started testing, as I say, stopped it on the 12th of March. For still, it's not abundantly clear to me why they actually did that. But even now, we seem to be being told, first of all, we have a promise from Boris Johnson that test, track and trace will be available by the 1st of June. I thought there was a slight change of language from the Health Secretary today, because he seems to say on track, which I'm not quite sure what that means in terms of missing the target. But that issue of testing, which if you looked at the international comparisons, and Germany, South Korea, it was always there that had to be the route out of the lockdown. So it's ineptitude that worries me more than anything. And I think it's something clearly that will be considered when there is, whatever the form the inquiry takes in relation to this, the judgments the government's made every step of the way over recent months.
Yes, testing has definitely been the key kind of winning strategy and fundamental to it in countries worldwide which have luckily seen a flattening of that curve. And you know, you've had Matt Hancock on the April the 17th saying, I'd love to be able to wave a magic wand, have PPE fall from the sky. And then, as you said, and also on April the 5th, we had 17.5 million antibody tests ordered by the government, which were a complete failure. Do you think that's something a public inquiry or the committee inquiry should look into?
Yes, and whatever the inquiry takes, those kinds of issues are clearly absolutely vital. I mean, on the issue of personal protective equipment, the government seems to have been relying on the one hand on world supply, when clearly if there's a global pandemic, that supply is going to be under, there's going to be huge demand on that. Secondly, I thought that domestically they tended to rely a lot on big companies. Nothing wrong with that. I think in a pandemic, you have to take, provided the stuff is of the appropriate standard, which is another issue, but then you do take it where you can get it from. But I felt that they could have relied a lot more on smaller companies. And I had, there were lots of instances. I think Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Minister of the Cabinet Office, sent a list of potential companies to the government. I didn't think they pursued that avenue in the way that they should have done. And that was a huge issue. And not just as a Shadow Home Secretary, but as a constituency MP, these things, they were coming forward, and there were action that needed to be taken to ensure people were protected on the front line. So I think there's a huge issue around that not just, yes, of course I want an inquiry to look at it, but at the same time, I want it dealt with now. I don't want people going back to work without the appropriate personal protective equipment. I think it's absolutely essential. It's dealt with not just, looking at what has happened in the future, absolutely, but I want it dealt with now so that people going to work are safe.
Absolutely. And there's also the fact that so many nurses were effectively gagged by their workplaces and by orders from the government to not be able to report or say online, ask for supplies which are there to save their lives. And also, we've had the fact that nurses now, there's been this whole kind of narrative around the clapping for key workers, which I agree with, but some nurses are now speaking out and saying, well, I just feel that people are being encouraged to clap, but you've cut our NHS this entire time so much that we're just having to operate from a place which is completely underfunded and has been decimated over the years. So going forward in terms of the future for the NHS, do you think that this will become an argument for selling the NHS off and privatization? Or do you think that hopefully it will be able to be saved in terms of remain a public service for the UK? And how do you think Labour can help the NHS in terms of keeping the value that it has and keeping it within the United Kingdom as a public service?
Well, one of the things I did before entering Parliament, was one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done, actually, was to write a biography of Aneurin Bevan, who is my political hero and whose idea of healthcare, free at the point of delivery based on need, not wealth, is, I think, my view, I struggle to think of something more powerful that any Labour government has done, actually, since in Labour's existence. And I think that the achievement of that and the way that that has changed the lives of people, not just the late 1940s, but of generations to come, is one of the most remarkable gifts Labour has given to the country. And for me, protecting the NHS should always be at the very, very top of Labour's priority list. And we will resist any of these attempts that would come to dismantle it. And then, let's be fair as well, we clap on a Thursday night, of course we do, and I think that respect and appreciation is very important. But surely as well, this crisis has revealed that what people are paid does not reflect their contribution to society. It's the argument I made in the Commons on Monday, where, you know, we've had to, in this crisis, rely on people to keep the country running. And the people, and their value has been absolutely tremendous to us. They're the heroes and heroines of our front line. Yet, seriously, do we pay them what they're worth? No, we don't, and we haven't. And they've been subject to a decade of pay freezes, pay being held down. And then when it came to a crisis, the country really, really needed them. Secondly, have they always had the PPE that they need? No, they haven't. So we have to, I think, as time goes past, and I hope we do move out of this crisis, though it's going to have a profound impact on the country for many years to come. I hope that, number one, we remember what the National Health Service did and how we came to rely on it. And I hope it will be a message for this century that our National Health Service is as valuable now as it was when it was first founded back in July 1948. Secondly, I hope it will show that we need to value properly the people who've kept our country running and the people that we've relied on so much. And I hope, if nothing else, that those things powerfully do come out of this terrible period our country is going through.
Absolutely, and definitely agree with the fact that the NHS is such a powerful and brilliant Labour legacy and should be protected as such. You know, we've seen the pandemic has highlighted and in many ways exacerbated the inequalities, stark inequalities that we have in society. And hopefully when we rebuild, it will be in a way where we don't go back to the normal. We don't go straight back to business. It's something which we're discussing in an environmental panel that Labour will become synonymous with the green recovery, that as I've seen in parliamentary news, that you've got Keir Starmer uniting with so many mayors and basically calling for homelessness to be abolished permanently, which is a brilliant step for Labour. So yeah, absolutely. I wanted to just go to questions from the audience now. So firstly, we've got a question from Abdi. So Abdi asked, with the recent U-turn by the government on migrant NHS workers paying the NHS surcharge, which we've mentioned, should Labour push for all key workers to be exempt, many of whom will be clapping for at 8 p.m. tonight?
The simple answer to that question is, of course, I want to do more on this issue and on many, many other issues as well. I think it relates back, though, to where, you know, when I indicated on my opening speech, really, absolutely there's more we want to do on this and other issues, but we've got to try and pick particular battles and win them with the parliamentary arithmetic as it is. So, you know, I wish we were in government and could do more things. I want us to get to government in 2024. But obviously, we're going to have to continue with this strategy that we're using, which is picking our battles carefully and then getting the public support that we need. And that's obviously what we'll continue to do.
Glad to hear it. So next, we've got a question from Matthew Howard. Matthew asked, Refuge says that the calls to their helpline in April are up by 25%, while visits to their website are up by 150%. What action should the government take in order to prevent the number of incidents of domestic violence from rising during the pandemic? Something we touched on, but we can elaborate on a tad.
Right. Well, thank you for that question, because I actually came up with a package of measures a few weeks ago, which I went out and advanced on the media. So first of all, you need a guaranteed pot of money. Now, I worked with the sector. I came up with a figure of around about £75 million, which, I'm not saying for a moment that's going to keep the sector going over a long period of time, but it was felt that that was enough for emergency funding. Now, the government 4 days later announced 76 million, which I think might have something to do with the original figure that I put forward. But then it seemed clear that that was spread out around a number of government departments and a number of different pots. And it wasn't clear that that was exclusively for domestic abuse and the violence against women and girls sector. I also said that you needed specialist services ring-fenced. So, for example, migrant women is a classic example of this, because one of the problems particularly is, things like no recourse to public funds, which I've spoken out about, my first week in the job, but also because if someone is of uncertain migration status, that's often used by the controlling party or the abuser to actually cause further problems. Now, I said, where men are victims is another example of a specialist service. We have disabled victims. There's a number of different specialist parts of this sector that also needed to have ring-fence money. That money had to be easily accessible. I actually suggested there should be one pot, because one of the problems you have at the moment is there are pots of money in different places. Some lies with the police and crime commissioners, some lies with local authorities. So often it's not abundantly clear where you go for the pot. So I argued for one pot of money, and I still stand by that. Secondly, ring fencing the money for specialist parts of the sector. And thirdly, obviously getting the money quickly to the front line. And I've been arguing that for weeks. The government seems to have moved a bit. They seem to have been announcing money, like, for example, the helpline of £2 million, but there is going to be a battle ahead in terms of making sure that that money gets to absolutely where it's needed, and it needs to get there fast.
Certainly agree, and we've got quite a few UK people, businesses, and sort of working together to highlight that kind of impact. The fact that we've got "You Are Not Alone" as a hashtag that's been trending quite a lot. We've got Boots participating in a scheme. Some supermarkets are now enrolling into that as well, to highlight the fact that you can ask for help in supermarkets, etc. So that kind of unified spirit has been really, really nice to see. And I hope that your idea of it will be implemented in terms of one centralized pot, because that sounds a lot more efficient. So next we've got a question from Tashi Tahir saying, great news regarding the surcharge. Lots of NHS workers' families are also subjected to the charge. A key worker will still have to pay around £7,000 in visa fees for their family of 4, however. Will Labour be tabling an amendment to the bill covering NHS workers' families?
Well, we'll now have to make a judgment going forward as to precisely what the scope of the government's announcement is, and a judgment as to whether we can push it further forward. I mean, in terms of, Holly Lynch, our Shadow Immigration Minister, will be doing committee stays, and there's a lot of things, obviously, in an ideal world we would want. What we need to do is to make a judgment as to realistically where we can push the government to, because we could put down 10 amendments of things that in an ideal world we want, they'd all get voted down, and that was the last we'd hear of it. So what we need to now do is take stock of this announcement, precisely who it covers, because forgive me, but I'm deeply cynical about this government's announcements as to precisely what they do cover. See what it is, and then take a look at how we can push it even further. But please make no mistake, we'll be, over the next 3-4 years in opposition, and it is going to be 4 years in opposition, I fear, we will be pushing as far ahead as we can on things, but making, as I say, these strategic judgments as to what realistically we can get, and making sure we get public support for it.
Certainly, I can definitely forgive the cynicism there as well. Next, we've got a question from Chris He's asked, how does Labour intend to balance constructive criticism with the possibility of the public seeing the opposition politicising the government's response to COVID-19?
Well, I think this is, this touches on my opening remarks in terms of what we're trying to do, really, because we are still, we're past the first peak, it seems, of the pandemic. I mean, it looks like that, the trend looks like that it is moving down, but you've still got to be extremely careful about a second peak. I mean, that happened with the Spanish flu, all those decades ago, and there are concerns about that. But I think, my own conversations with constituents, I still hold surgeries over the telephone, of course, can't hold them in person these days, but in conversations I have with my constituents, I get the impression that, what they want is for us to be constructive and to push things forward. That's why on domestic abuse, I said it was a priority. What I haven't done is just go out criticising the government. I've criticised, but I've also then suggested to them what I want them to do and what I think is possible for them to do. So I think it's about getting that balance right, really. It's about making sure that we're not just out there criticising for criticism's sake, because that's not going to help anyone at the moment, but it is both holding the government to account, which we are doing in Parliament in its hybrid form and in the media, but also on top of that then as well, where we can, suggesting things that the government could do. And I think that's the balance we need to strike.
Certainly. And so far, Labour's and the cabinet, the shadow cabinet, has done an absolutely amazing job. I think that's been widely picked up in the media. There's been so many articles just really applauding the way that it's been done, which has been just very forensic, professional, and is not criticising for criticism's sake, which has been really refreshing to see. And there has been some cross-party support for amendments, bills, etc. So that's really refreshing and positive to see. So our next question, slightly different, is from Pranav, who asked, can we also have a 4-day work week as a back-to-work measure after the pandemic, just like New Zealand? So Jacinda Ardern just suggested a 4-day work week, which has worked well in some Nordic countries. So yeah, Nick, can we have a 4-day working week?
If only I could just declare one over the away. I think actually this actually relates to the kind of points we've been making about the furlough scheme, because the furlough scheme has been announced to remain until the end of October, but it's going to change from early August. And I think we've been trying to make really a number of points around it. One of them is in terms of part-time working, flexibility, going back to work certain days, having a flexibility as to how that works. Secondly, that there shouldn't be any cliff edges, because if there are cliff edges, then there's going to be severe consequences for jobs and businesses. But also, I think, and Annalise Dodds, our Shadow Chancellor, has made this point a number of times, we need to look at now different sectors are starting to require different things. It isn't like at the start where very quickly we need to get a furlough scheme into being. There are now starting to be quite wide differences across the different sectors. So I think that flexibility in the furloughing scheme going forward is going to be very important.
Yes, it will definitely change our economy permanently. And I think a lot of people have realised as well that the jobs where their bosses have said, no, you absolutely can't work from home, has proved completely the antithesis of that. So definitely, and that flexibility, I think, will be welcomed in such a globalised economy as well, and one that changes so much. So our next question was from Dan Lewis, who said, George Monbiot highlighted this week how the Global Health Security Index last year ranked the UK second in the world for pandemic readiness, with the US in first. How has this proved so far off the mark? Have we collectively been guilty of a Western bias, ignoring the experiences of Southeast Asian countries in fighting SARS, MERS, etc.?
Well, I think one of there seems to, these are questions, I think, that will obviously require a firm forensic look in due course. But just if I can give you some initial thoughts about it. The first question is, did we prepare for the right type of pandemic? I think is the first major question that there is. And that goes back to exercise sickness in 2016. And remember, the government hasn't been transparent about that. We don't quite know the details of that exercise in the way that we should. So did we first of all prepare for the right type of pandemic? The second is, and this is one of the themes of the evening, really, isn't it? Looking at international comparisons. Why didn't we learn appropriate lessons? And I think we can talk about it in the longer term. Yes, SARS, for example, what lessons were learned from that by the government? But even things that were more recent. I mean, if you wanted to have an example of a country that seems to have kept its deaths to a very low level, look no further than South Korea. And it seems to me quite obvious that it's their test, track and trace that does it. But even, and we may come to this in a moment, even in March, when we were seeing those awful scenes in northern Italy, did we not learn from that there was something that we needed to do? So I think there's a whole question here. Did we prepare for the right type of pandemic? And second, have we learned international lessons, both in the longer term and in the immediate short term as well?
Definitely. And we've also seen the kind of sudden change in tack at lightning speed from the right-wing press, who were reporting Italy's death toll as it rose in sort of seismic kind of proportions. And as soon as ours unfortunately overtook theirs, it's been completely diminished. But I think we actually have a question largely surrounding that in a minute. But before that, something I was actually going to touch on, we've got a question from Glenn, who asked, are you worried about teaching unions being characterised as the new enemy within by the government and the right-wing press? And if so, will Labour resist this characterisation of our teaching staff? Obviously, we've seen the kind of Daily Mail awful rhetoric around militant unions and teachers being work shy, and let our teachers be heroes, to contextualize that question for our members. So yeah, so how will Labour be able to resist this characterization of our teaching staff, who a lot have spoken out and said, I don't want to go back until it's safe, and 10,000 new members have joined unions?
Well, firstly, the whole characterization was totally inaccurate anyway, because for a start, there have been a significant number of teachers in schools throughout the pandemic. They've been teaching the children of key workers and indeed vulnerable children as well. And for my own children, frankly, the teachers of the local primary school here where I'm sat in my constituency have been sending out work every day, online learning, keeping in contact and working throughout the crisis. So this characterization that somehow teachers haven't been working throughout the pandemic and there's an issue that they suddenly start working again, that is totally inaccurate for a start. Secondly, I really don't like this narrative that somehow there are different interests here, that you've got the teacher's interest, you've got the children's interest, you've got the parents' interest. The interest is the same. Everybody needs to have confidence of a safe working environment. That's what you need to make this work. And again, I contrast the position where I'm sat in Wales with what the Westminster government is doing. The Welsh government has published a decision-making framework, and they formalised meetings between the teachers' unions, the NEU Cymru, local authorities, the relevant commissioners, by the way, like the Children's Commissioner and others, and they are bringing them together to come to that agreement and to get confidence so that we can come to an appropriate date for everybody to go back and to feel confident that we are safe. I wish the Westminster government, frankly, instead of indulging in all this divisive rhetoric, would actually do a very similar thing and recognise that everybody's interests are the same. We all want that safe environment, and let's work together and let's get it in place.
Absolutely agreed with you. I can only hope that Westminster listen to you more. So next we've got a question from Amy Hall. She asked, is Labour planning to push for a minimum wage to apply to everyone again during the crisis? A lot of minimum wage workers have been furloughed on 80% pay. 80% of minimum wage is not minimum wage.
No, and I mean this touches on a wider issue really, and obviously there's a huge difference here between what Labour can do in power and what it can do in opposition. But that highlights, I think, one injustice of the crisis. And you're absolutely right to say 80% of minimum wage clearly isn't the minimum wage, but there is a huge debate here that Labour will be very much taking part in the months and years to come with regard to low pay and with regard to how we value the contribution of people in our society. Because low wages, frankly, have been endemic for the last 10 years. We haven't valued as a society what people do. People have not been paid the value of their contribution. And I think there's going to be a larger debate on this as we come out of the coronavirus pandemic and we see its impact on the economy. And I can tell you, Labour will be on the side of fair wages for everybody.
Certainly, and always has been historically. Thank you for that. So Jack, coming back to the kind of media characterization and demonization question asked, oh God, something else just got upvoted, so that's gone down a minute. Okay, here we go. How can opposition best hold the government accountable when journalists and government supporters are actively working, sorry, people are still upvoting, discredit institutions and experts, both global and domestic, treating it as another populist campaign rather than a public health crisis?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember some years ago, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster saying people had had enough of experts. Now government ministers can't wait to run to a microphone and say they're relying on expert advice. So there's been something of a change, I think, in attitudes towards that. But in terms of, look, communicating is so important. The Labour Party throughout its existence has faced sections of the press that have been extremely hostile to it. I have been writing a biography of Harold Wilson, who was another Labour Prime Minister and leader who faced an extraordinarily hostile press. But I think what we have to do is you have to have confidence in your values. And yes, like take the Harold Wilson example, who I've been writing a book about. He existed in a very different environment to the one we now have. But when I look at his life, I can still see the same Labour values in there of social justice, of wanting to tackle poverty in our society. I can still see all those things there. So I think we've got to have confidence in our values, and we've got to communicate them in the most effective way that we can, whether it's on the media, whether it's through social media, whether it's through, obviously not during the pandemic, but face-to-face conversations on the doorstep. So I think that's what we really do have to do.
Certainly, and thank you also for that. I mean, Rebecca Long-Bailey, just before the Labour leadership campaign, actually commented that the one thing that Labour hadn't done quite so well was having a kind of centralised rebuffing system for when things like this happen, when it comes to people in the right-wing media, populist media characterising us, MPs, the leader, whomever it might be, as something we're not, and kind of completely misportraying what we're doing as an opposition and as a party. So I think, yeah, going forward, it's definitely about trusting in those values and just knowing that that is why we are in this party and pushing to become a governing party which can change society as a whole for the better. I just wanted to break now as it's 2 minutes to 8. So everyone will be back in 5. We're just going to go for the Thursday clap for key workers.
I'll leave the phone.
Yeah. Hello again.
Hello.
My residences have finally quietened. So coming back to the questions in the chat, we've got one from Tom Cox, which says, one thing that everyone can agree on is that the pandemic has highlighted that skilled workers is not synonymous with well-paid workers, as you mentioned. Certainly not with frontline key workers in this pandemic. With this in the public's consciousness, people are upvoting. How can Labour address the disparity of pay post-lockdown and ensure people have a salary that reflects the hard work done by underpaid workers?
I think the reality in the end is we will need a Labour government to do that, and that's very much the way we will campaign. But I think this pandemic has revealed, I think, unfairnesses and inequalities in our society in a number of different ways. But this particular aspect of it about, it's like I said in the House of Commons earlier in the week, earnings do not reflect your contribution, and low skilled is not the same as low paid. They are very different things. And I think we really do need to be clear as a party that we cannot go back to the status quo. We cannot go back to the way things were before this pandemic, where we do have a decade of low pay, where we have, and it goes absolutely our key workers and the need to pay them properly. And we need to be making that case. We need to be reminding people of all they did for us during this pandemic. But there's a whole agenda as well around insecure work that was, I'm afraid, far too common in our society that we also need to be talking about. And I know this is something in the Shadow Cabinet we will be doing going forward, but let's not stop reminding people of the value of the work throughout this crisis. And let's then make that clear to people as well, that we can't just do what we've just done, which is clap our key workers and then just accept that things should go back to being how they were before, because that would be to let them down.
Precisely. And a lot of people, I think, have realised also what the fundamental kind of sectors are that run society, which isn't hedge fund managers, but are cleaners and NHS care workers, doctors, nurses, our shopkeepers, grocery store managers, people like that, not people who are putting their billions and millions in offshore tax havens. So our next question comes from, let's see, Henry Mendoza, who said, further to Abdi's question earlier, long term if not immediately, will Labour push towards or make it party policy to remove the NHS surcharge completely so that no migrant, EU or non-EU, has to pay it, rather than only NHS, care or key workers?
Well, it's exactly the same as I said previously. I mean, we will push in the most targeted way that we can through the immigration bill. I mean, obviously going forward and the policy making process to, the next general election, obviously, our members are very much crucial to that, and we'll obviously produce our set of proposals. But the situation I'm in at the moment, when we have just over 200 MPs, I've got to pick, as I've said, very targeted battles, which is what I'll continue to do. But that shouldn't, that isn't the limit of the ambition of a Labour government. Obviously, a Labour government would want to do a lot more, but I've got to, at the moment, just be quite targeted in what we do and try to build public support and try and force concessions out of the government. And unfortunately, it's the frustration of opposition, but clearly a Labour government would want to do a lot more. Of
course. So our next question comes from Marcus Atkin. Touching on a little bit of what we spoke on earlier, the Conservatives reportedly want to revoke the solutions we have found for homelessness during the pandemic. So how can we ultimately prevent this for long-term systemic change?
But you see, I think there's a very simple but very powerful point here. If we could all but eliminate homelessness during a global pandemic, why can't you do it in ordinary times when there isn't a global pandemic? And I think that's the question that people will be asking, that the government did have the capacity to actually provide a roof over people's heads. They did it, it seems, out of necessity, but there's no reason why you couldn't always do it. And I think that the challenge of homelessness and to end homelessness is central, I believe, to what we should be campaigning on and what we should be doing. And I think we do have a very powerful argument now. If you could do it then, why not now? And that's the question I think we have to keep pressing in the years ahead.
Definitely. And it's something the public, I think, noticed immediately, you know, that everyone in policy was brilliant. And there was that kind of backdoor policy, just complete termination, where they just did not renew the funding and they didn't really announce that. So it's really good that that's being highlighted and that long-term change can hopefully be brought about with enough pressure from the opposition and the media. So our next question was from Henry Mendoza. COVID-19 has led to understandable restrictions on migration in and out of the UK in order to flatten the curve. So what can Labour do to make sure that long term this doesn't lead to further hostility to immigration and migrants?
By making the positive case for migration, as I've been doing throughout the week, and also what I've been trying to do this week is to debate this issue with the government in a different way, and to really be able to show, you know, I have always argued throughout my political career of the huge benefits of migration to our country. But what I did this week in Parliament was to make that argument, but also to make it very specific. Across England and Wales, where I currently sit, there are 180,000 EU nationals working in our NHS and in our care sector. I have just gone out on the doorstep and I've clapped for them along with all our other key frontline workers. And what I said on Monday in the Commons was, it is hypocrisy for government ministers to be out doing that clapping on a Thursday, and then on a Monday pass an immigration bill and not troop through lobbies literally, but virtually vote for a bill that sends a message that they're unwelcome. So the simple answer is that we've got to keep making the positive case about migration. And I really do hope, there is much that I hope for, that we can change about our society out of this terrible crisis. But one of the things I would really like to see, valuing our key workers and valuing those workers who've come from abroad and given us so much.
Absolutely. I think we can all agree with you there unreservedly. So we've got a question on universities and kind of revealing the inequalities in this system. So Glenn Armstrong asked, do you think this crisis has revealed the fragility of the system of funding for our universities? For example, undergraduate numbers have been capped to prevent large universities outbidding small ones for students. Does this show the inherent issues with having a model that makes undergraduates consumers rather than students? So I suppose that comes back to kind of exacerbating the inequalities that we've seen.
Yes, and you know, this is one of so many different aspects of our society where a light has been actually shone. I mean, I was for a number of years a university lecturer. I never saw the people I taught as consumers. I always saw them as students, and I think that that's the way we should proceed. And there are issues, huge issues going forward with our university sector and funding, by the way. There's a particular issue, you know, here where I'm sat in Wales, there are issues, and there are around the country. And it is yet another part of our society where, coming out of this pandemic, we need to be making the case for equality of opportunity, equality, and also for a university sector that is actually serving our students. And by the way, whilst of course our universities are of great importance, there's a whole other issue about other skills and vocational skills, where we really do need in this country to be improving that aspect of our education system, something we need to be doing coming out of this pandemic.
Absolutely. So there's also a question about testing in general. So on May the 1st, obviously the government announced it had reached its target of 100,000 tests. At that point, they hadn't conducted the tests, just posted the testing kits. So now with this kind of what we mentioned earlier, in terms of being on track for contact testing and tracing by June, do you think the government is doing enough now? Obviously, we know they've certainly failed on implementing that quickly. Do you think it's doing enough now, and what can we expect to see going forward in terms of testing being available for the wider population, and how quickly?
Well, they're playing catch up, frankly.
Yeah.
And there have been issues with this testing throughout. And, you know, testing or lockdown was not an either or. There was no reason why you couldn't have had the lockdown on the 23rd of March and continued to make substantial progress on testing. And we talk about meeting the target at the end of April. That was because nearly 40,000 test kits were posted, basically, to get the number over 100,000. Now, what we should be seeing is what's happened in Germany, what's happened in South Korea. We should be seeing this enormous ramping up of testing, because that is the only viable route forward for us to avoid a second spike. And that's what the government has to do. I mean, on track for the 1st of June, I'm not entirely sure what that actually means, but we need to get to a testing capacity where people can actually be confident that if they need a test, they can actually go and get one. And obviously there has to be the priority for our key frontline workers. Of course there does, and that goes without saying. But you need to have that capacity ramped up. And frankly, we are going to be at the 1st of June. I mean, this is months that have gone past when the government knew that was the only viable way out. They should have done a lot more in the past, but at this precise moment, I want them to ramp it up so that we can get to a stage where the easing of the lockdown has alongside it the testing, tracing, and isolation we require. And by the way, as well, you know, I'm talking about test, trace, and isolate. Remember, we need support for people to isolate as well. It isn't easy for someone to isolate if they live in a shared house with a number of other people. It's all very well saying, oh, well, you know, go and isolate. You know, people who rent a room in a house of multiple occupancy, or they live in a small flat, it's not so easy to just say to them, go and isolate. So I think the government needs to be looking at support it can give to people to implement the strategy as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's certainly true that testing has been that key factor and common denominator in the kind of countries that have done really, really well. When you look at the fact that you've got South Korea, China, Japan, and Taiwan, they've got a combined population of about 24 times the UK. They've had less warning and have recorded fewer than 3,500 deaths between them. So on that, which countries do you think we can learn from and should continue to learn from on things apart from testing as we progress through hopefully flattening completely this curve?
I think that if the government was going to, I mean, there are a number of things from other countries to learn from, but I'm a great admirer of the leadership of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. I think that apart from the successful strategy of elimination that she's pursued, politics is about your policy, of course it is. But in crises like this, it's also about clear communication and leadership. And I think time and time again, Jacinda Ardern over recent months has really, frankly, shown up our Prime Minister, actually, in terms of the leadership that she's actually shown. She's clear, she's charismatic, and she really is able to take people with her in terms of what she's doing. And I think that her leadership throughout this crisis really has been a model for us to learn from, frankly.
I couldn't agree with you more. The Facebook event for tonight was actually you've probably seen it, the kind of montage of Jacinda Ardern and Boris Johnson's comparison chronologically as it went along, and how much it shows Boris up. And it just is such a testament to empathy as well, because she's not only been so strong and had such clarity, but also just demonstrated profound compassion. I mean, I think her address to the nation was clearer in her sweatshirt, a very personable and relatable one, than Boris's kind of 3-stage graph that I think policy advisors and people in all sectors could make not heads nor tails from. So from that, what is Labour's sort of message to people now in terms of in terms of how we should go forward and hold the government to account as citizens as well? What kind of things do you think we should focus on? And how do you think we can kind of counteract that populist media and also keep other workers, not just NHS workers, but people like teachers, safe?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of Labour's approach going forward, I think we've both got to be critical and constructive, and I think that's what we've tried to do, and that's what we will continue to do. But in terms of what people can do to help us, well, it's getting behind us when we're making certain points, and this week is a very good example of it, because I started on Monday, obviously speaking in the Commons on the immigration bill. Keir at Prime Minister's questions then raised the issue of the immigration health surcharge in relation to NHS and care workers. And then we had an online petition, which people immediately came out, supported. People were speaking in the media, people were speaking on social media, on Facebook, out on the media. All those things contributed to forcing a U-turn within 24 hours, where we had the doubling down from Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister's question, saying, coming up with that 900 million figure, saying the NHS needs the money, I'm not doing anything about it, to getting to that stage the next day. And, there is, going forward though, the other thing I would say is this, and I can't really stress this enough. It's about people saying that we've seen things in this crisis that tell us the world can't be the same again. We've discussed homelessness for this evening. If the government could solve homelessness during a global pandemic, why can't it solve homelessness forever, for example? If we say we value our key workers, which we do, don't let them have a decade again where their wages are being held down and they're not being given the rewards that they should have. Don't let low pay be endemic in our society. I think it's that really that we need coming out of this. It's people saying together, the world has to change going forward and it can't be the same again.
Couldn't agree more there. I think it's a absolutely unique opportunity for us to bring about change. And as Sadiq Khan has kind of shown, just in terms of London and repurposing the spacing, how spatial distribution and how that can change can have a brilliant impact on the environment and can help us to entrench the kind of progression we've had with pollution coming down rather than just going back to normal. So I kind of just wanted to get your views on other countries and their handling of the crisis. Sweden, for example, I know you admire Germany's. But what sort of countries do you think have done the best in terms of handling the crisis? And is there a kind of way that we can speak? Is there a way that we can communicate and Labour can help push those sort of strategies? Because obviously we're not out of it yet.
No, and I think, as I've said in previous answers, I think, the leadership of Jacinda Ardern, the testing capacity of somewhere like Germany, test, track and trace used extensively like somewhere like South Korea. There's lots of examples we can pick up. But there's also, I think, a point I wanted to make with regard to this, because if you think about Germany, for example, Germany has its lab capacity, but it's also because Germany has a very strong manufacturing manufacturing base to start with. That's one of the reasons why they're able to produce the testing kits, they're able to produce ventilators. And there is a lesson in there as well in terms of our own manufacturing sector and the support our manufacturing sector needs going forward. And again, you know, when things are difficult for a country, it's manufacturing that the country actually turns to. And I think there's a real lesson in there as well about how well prepared we are and how we need to support our manufacturing sector and our workers going forward too.
Well, thank you very much for that, Nick. That's all we've got time for tonight on questions. We've covered quite the range of topics, from homelessness to testing, tracing, quite a few different countries and their responses, how Labour is progressing and scrutinising the government and will continue to do so. So thank you so much, Nick, for joining us tonight and answering questions live, both from our members and from me. So we'd love to continue the kind of discussion and do events with you in the future. So thank you very, very much.
Can I just say thank you as well? I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed the range of questions, and it's nice, frankly, to get more time to answer questions than the few seconds you get when you're out on the media and you're constantly interrupted. So it's great to actually come on and be able to have a discussion. So I just like to thank everybody on here for coming on and making this such a very enjoyable evening. And of course, I would love to do it again in the future. So thank you. And thank you to you, Cecilia, as well, for the questions and make it, you know, comparing the evening, if I can put it that way, in such an effective way. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nick. And thank you everyone for contributions.
Thank you.